We have one final presentation by Aditya Premraj, and it may turn out that we will have an additional juror or two. Jonathan Rose, who is a director at Pryor & Partners, may join us. And we may also be joined by Alan Organshi, who's a professor at Yale, who is visiting Jonathan Rose here in London, and they're going to come by. So we may sort of have a flood of respondents in a short while. But also we have Katerina Borzi back for this final presentation. So Katerina, you should feel free to join in if you wish. Now, Aditya's project is in many ways one of the most graphically rich that we have ever seen in the program, but it also, like many of the others, involves a kind of combination of taking a typological precedent and then asking about what happens if we change some of the driving conditions. In Aditya's case, the work starts from a reconsideration of some of the rougher edges of Croydon, rougher in the sense of the fabric rather than the social character of it. But the starting point is that there are a lot of areas that have been rather fragmented and tortured by the combination of infrastructure, employment lands, different sorts of master plans that have come in. And what Aditya is trying to do is to use a combination of typologies to address an area that will allow the difference, in a way, to become complementary in as a sort of pattern of integration. Again, like with the sort of general ideas that we saw just now with Zeynep's work, it involves a kind of thinking about the crossovers between care, working, learning, and something that is a kind of theme within our reconsideration of domestic life and work life. Aditya.
Care through making. Peripheral areas in London are facing demands of regeneration of their employment lands through building communities. And we can think about building communities not just through local adjacencies to a geographical area, but through shared interest. With an aging population, young professionals and families wanting to live, work, share resources, and actively engage with their cities, we have to take a moment to think about how care is no longer a space of cure within an institution, but it's changing our patterns of domesticity and work life. Care comes in the form of the self, a Sisyphusian task of everyday rituals and routines, and crafting one's own being in a space of retreat. Care of the family, a space of grooming and governance of our children to become active participants in civic society. Care comes in the form of collective craftsmanship. Richard Sennett argues that there's a strong connection between the movement of the hand and the mind, which affects our holistic well-being, and being engaged in our own craft while being in attunement with others around us. Croydon underwent a rapid development in the 60s in its town center, and now 1 in every 8 office building is left abandoned, and it's now facing a challenge of perception and increased housing demands. So like other boroughs, it has identified its brown sites as opportunity areas for development and regenerating land value. So our immediate strategy to mixed-use development is to stack, and the ground becomes prioritized by either production or housing. While I'd like to argue that we can create and generate value through bringing these elements together and harnessing their synergies through adjacencies. These peripheral areas are characterized by condensed town centers, rows of repetitive terrace housing, and loosely placed shed typologies. So this is what we imagine when we look at Croydon. These hyper-individualized cells of living, these sheds which are now retail, and the town center, which is a space of employment, all divided by infrastructure and offer very little urbanity if we want to think of these as spaces to live and work. There's another side to Croydon which has access to this incredible biodiversity. And we're beginning to take landscape very seriously in the way that we build and acknowledging that it affects our well-being. And so boroughs have a limited set of choices when dealing with employment lands. We want to generate more value out of them. One strategy is to adaptive reuse existing sheds, creating workspaces which act as meanwhile projects adjacent to living environments. Another strategy is to remove most of the sheds and retain some and increase quantitatively the amount of housing that we place on the leftover bits. These housing, this is a master plan that's been released 5 years ago. So this project uses a regular courtyard typology on a gridded street system and achieves densities that's sustainable for a development model. And this is a portfolio of projects that we can see across London. While these offer a rich hybridization of industry and housing, it has a limited and missed opportunity in thinking about the way we will live and work. So the diagram is usually a thickened ground with the housing stacked on one side and an active frontage on the other. A very similar diagram can be seen in the Accordia patio house in Cambridge, which uses the same diagram of a clear ground, studio space on one end, and domestic life on the other, with a single puncture in a 4.5 by 20 meter bar. And the garage space, or the back of house space, which faces the Muse Street, becomes an integral part of our domestic life. And the Accordia master plan is working with a trajectory of rethinking the suburban model, where we have the street, the front porch, the house, and then a private back garden. They flip that diagram around, creating a communal garden and orthogonal forms which are structured around Muse and garden streets. And so using this patio house, they create a living environment where we can collectively live, immersed in landscape. And they achieve in density about 47 dwellings per hectare. And if we take the similar diagram to Croydon in an area which is got employment lands on the left, the residential on the right, and a park on the south, and productive landscape on the north, by introducing services and employment, we can take this diagram a step further. And imagine an associative way of life on the ground, which is shared, engaging in activities of making, care, living, and working. So we can imagine 20 by 100 meter striated blocks, which are structured around civic yards and garden streets. So the front of the house becomes a work edge, and the back of the house becomes a domestic edge. And we create this gradient of different intensities on the ground of working, mobility, living, and being in access with biodiversity. The striated blocks can be splayed, allowing the gardens to come in, creating a varied threshold along the length of the block. And so we create a neighborhood that's almost immersed in nature, while also having access to hardscape and softscape in front and back of the house. The housing is informed from Jürgen Teller's photography studio, which is 3 volumes divided by 2 punctures. This photography studio is in one of the bars, one becomes an exhibition space, and one becomes a domestic space. And you get these sequestered spaces within a linear system, which allows different qualities of light through, and also allows the house to be a space of work, exhibition, and domestic. So the 30 by 100 meter block can be imagined as 3 volumes with the domestic edge, and the back of the house, so the garage space, we can raise the height by 5 meters, which allows it to become a workshop. And we get a varied layering of living and working environments, and with light coming in through patios. And so we can think about a mixed tenure of domesticity and a communal ground, and different smaller units above. And this thinks about a more leisurely lifestyle in an area like Croydon. So we can think about a CLT framework, which allows the walls to be indeterminate and flexible, allowing the houses to combine within each house, which is 30 meters in length, 8 meters in width, can be divided into a 5 and 3 meter bar. The 3 meters allowing for circulation, and the 5 meter varies. And we can remove the cars from the back of the house and allow for a communal storage on the side, which allows that back of the house to become a workshop. And we can think about a variety of craftsmen engaging in these houses. And so children in the neighborhood can roll in to a neighbor's house and engage with different craftsmen and learn from different crafts. And within the house, we can think about full height windows, which allows workspace to become almost put on display. The work that we dedicate our lives to can be exhibited almost. And workspace above can be treated as spaces of retreat using light from above. And so we get these layers of spaces which are both inside and outside. And we can think about forms of assisted living where a person involved with providing care can engage with work while keeping an eye on those receiving care. And a landscape becomes a fourth layer in the house, which slowly begins to come in. And we get this light that punctures into the house along that axis. And we can think about the same diagram within a 20 by 100 meter block, which allows for a single puncture and prefabricated construction system using CLT, which allows the house to become affordable. We build only the shell and allow different components to be crafted over time. And raking the back of the house, the workshop, creating a landscape deck on top. And it allows that workshop to extend onto the street, engaging with that yard. So you can think about elders who are trying to downsize their homes, releasing their backup house to create employment opportunities for young professionals. We can think about grouping these in groups of 15 along that 100 meters. And so each house shares adjacency with 30 other neighbors, which is a good number for a multi-generational household. And we know the names of each of our neighbors. And we shelter life above, creating workspaces where you can pop your head out to the right and look at family life and onto the deck. And it's important to protect children from all that intense activity on the ground and give them their own space to learn and grow. And while we can do different activities in that back of the house, we need these large uninterrupted spaces for production. So we can imagine one 20 by 100 meter block being a CLT construction with 5 meter bays, being a space of collective craftsmanship while overlooking a civic yard and overlooking the back of house of a musician, a cyclist repairist, a tailor, all engaging in work while it being in attunement with each other. And it also allows for these spaces to be spaces of storage and logistics, which are essential to the industry. So while these are simple extrusions of a section, we achieve an incredible variety of typologies through the play of the punctures. And so the question arises, how do we bookend this new pattern of living and working? We can imagine using shared typologies that extend onto productive landscape on the north, city villa blocks that extend on with feather and fringe the park into the housing. And we can think about that varied system of gardens and civic yards. The gardens open out to 30 meters at the widest part of the display and 8 meters as narrow end, allowing a variation of landscape that comes in, ball games and recreational organizations along the widest end, and then communal gardening and child's play along the narrowest end. And we can set back one of the bars of the housing, creating greenhouses. And this allows us to form community engagement through gardening, while also being able to reconnect with that biodiversity and engage with non-human inhabitants in our neighborhoods. The civic yards in the front of the house becomes an extension of the productive landscape. It's wide enough for a 3-point turn for a truck to deliver goods. And these back of house environments, which we used to think were these dirty spaces just for services, are now spaces of hospitality and new civic grounds. And that linear armature allows us to think about that relationship between care of the self and collective craftsmanship, having civic grounds at our very doorsteps framed by the 4 typologies. And yards are spaces of negotiation between multiple actors. The extension of those yards into these shared typologies, which we know are physical containers, which we can play with volumes inside, connecting to become spaces of education or recreation. And the city villa blocks, we can pair in 3s, creating a shared ground between the 3, filtering the public park in. This allows us to also think about slowly increasing density with an efficient core, multi-directional views, and allows us to think about family life on multiple levels. We can think about a 20-meter by 10-meter block around a pinwheel with the triple aspect living, kitchen, and dining areas, and a balcony that wraps all around. And by pulling the core apart, we create spaces for the families to share, for 4 families to share. And this ladder system of movement creates a hierarchical movement which opens up the neighborhood, allowing the infrastructure, the landscape, the employment land, and the housing to begin to work together. And we can think about phasing this out in incremental modes of delivery with a package with all 4 typologies in each phase. And we can think about a cooperative system of management. And the park that is currently underutilized and cut off from the housing the housing begins to act as a catalyst that drives landscape and activating an active ground and engagement in these active lifestyles. And the north-south lines of movement, which now act as high streets, using this east-west mobility and drawing services in, we create a more livable neighborhood. And TfL is already investing in tram stops and making this a less car-reliant neighborhood. And so by rethinking the typologies that we can offer, that doesn't have to be accommodated by the large the high-rise towers, nor the semi-detached housing, we begin to care and regenerate Croydon's employment lands through the care of the self, the family, and collective craftsmanship. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure to come back to this, so I'm really delighted to see the range of work, and the draftsmanship is really, really exceptional, which is really nice. And I think I also like the way in which you move sort of from more diagrammatic studies to, detailed plans so in a way that you move between, the architectural organization, also sort of the urban reasoning. I think that's really nicely resolved. The drawings really help to make that quite a convincing case. I think that's really, really rich. Maybe also coming back to some of the other questions we posed about this morning, I think it's really enticing to think that we could live like that, where we sort of bring the care of the self and sort of collective craftsmanship together. If I look at your drawings, of course, it also could be something different now. I mean, I think maybe it's not just makers who live there. I could imagine a whole series of people happily joining this community independent of what they do. I think the one thing which is interesting to think about is maybe a little bit of question of scale, because that's relative, but effectively your diagrams, they could be denser, But I think this is not a critique on your project, but I think the way, the striation work, the way the sort of ground level works, the way you sort of intersect the residential and the making, there's no reason it just should be single family houses. I mean, if you think it further, they easily could be scaled up as well and sort of have maybe several layers of investigations. I think for me, the richness really is in the thinking about the ground level internal organization and this ground which sort of spans from the workspace, which could even be sort of, cut across a couple of units, and then you have these larger units. But effectively, this could almost be a model which could be sort of bigger and taller and denser at the same time, which is also interesting. Anyway, I'm happy to.
I agree. I was going to ask a question about density, actually, and whether there's a version of this which does reach higher and improve density, especially in a London situations. Croydon is, less dense, largely suburban around here. So I understand why you've tackled it that way. And having said that, congratulations on it. I mean, it's such an incredibly sort of thorough piece of work. It's sort of overwhelming because it just page after script, slide after slide. It's like whoa, and it's a lot to take in. There's an Atelier 5 scheme somewhere in Croydon. I've never been to see it. Maybe you have, but there's also lots of Atelier 5 schemes in Switzerland, and some that reminds me of the Halen scheme. The Halen scheme, which actually has more density to it. I think it probably cascades down. It reaches higher, cascades down. Families, smaller units at the top, bigger units at the bottom. Still very deep at the bottom as you're working through the sort of the feudal bit through the middle. Does that really, really beautifully. Fantastic drawings. And if there's a weakness in it, I think it's probably in the pinwheel forms don't tune in to that as well. I think they could be a bit more relaxed, maybe. Maybe they open as well. The sliding scale of civic use or play, there's play space that narrows down, gets much more intimate to the other end, is interesting as well because it offers a scale of use, which is interesting and enriching. You could maybe apply that to the pinwheel as well, and internally, the social spaces would have a kind of feel different as well. They're very sort of Teutonic at the moment. But I think it's a really great scheme. I think it's it's quite kind of modest as well in a way, and appropriate. So I think it's maybe when I've when I processed it a bit more, you come back to me.
Still haven't recovered. No. I'll give you some more breathing. Yeah, you must have an army of draftsmen working in the background here. I don't know. You've done it all yourself. Amazing. I really like the idea that you don't seem to have increased the density at all. In fact, if you've used 45 dwellings a hectare from Cambridge
To about 50.
50, so it's not, yeah. So actually, I don't think you have solved Croydon's industrial sill / residential intensification problem with this, have you? And that's what I like about it, and it's sort of provocative in that. Why? There's another way. We just make places that are decent places to live, and the tower blocks that are coming up left, right, and centre are sort of often used as excuses for viability and those other things. And it's quite nice to see that if you set your stall out like this, you can do a low density scheme. But having taken that on board and accepted that as the premise, I think you've accomplished it really, really brilliantly in terms of just the rigour of following it all through. I think that I like some bits you've introduced. I'm glad you've introduced a big shed at one end as well, to show that you can have some professional industrial use on the site still. And I think the dwellings that face that, the idea that you could have industrial makerspace or things that are connected to the dwelling that may or may not be used by the owner of the dwelling, but could be sublet to somebody who could interface with the bigger industrial use is really nice. And you said things like bike repair shops and things like that, and you get them all in the railway arches around Kentish Town and places, don't you? Which proves there's a demand for that small scale granularity. I think the main thing that I think you could have emphasised more was the care bit. I was really interested in the care, but it sort of seemed to be overtaken a bit by makers, and everybody had, lathes and, jigs making things. But actually, I wonder whether if you emphasised and gradated the scheme away from industry through something that was semi-industrial and makerspace into a more residential neighbourhood, moving across the site, and then address the care issues and put in a health centre or something that dealt with that. I just felt the care wasn't... It was a really great idea, care and multi-generational living coming together. And if you could get that landscape, it's almost like you've created a whole ecosystem then, from bigger industry, smaller industry, residential care and multi-generational community all in one area of Croydon next to the park. And you're beginning to explore that by going into the park and having the pavilion buildings, which I agree feel a little bit anomalous really with the rest of it. But no, I think there's some really interesting things going on it. And I really like I think you should probably just be more upfront and say this isn't about increasing density actually. This is a scheme that's just says stop doing that, because actually it's just ruining a lot of places. And actually if we can just nail the density to lower density and be a bit more relaxed about it, you're creating, in terms of longer term sustainability, you can see these buildings not going out of use, being used for hundreds of years, as opposed to buildings that we may be taking down in 30 years' time, because they're just not, the program's just wrong. So I think it's really interesting. I'll hand over to somebody else to comment.
I know Chris is going to want to come in on this later, but I'll jump in here. Partly because of this question of density. Intriguingly, Aditya did experiment with increasing heights and densities. Didn't work. And in a way, that was an interesting aspect of the research, is that he, in a sense, discovered the limitations of the type in relation to density. But at the same time, he did broaden the offer that is there in Accordia in some really interesting ways. One is that opening up this possibility of the dual puncture, it allows for greater internal differentiation within each of the households. And that also provided an opportunity to consider diversification of the overall set because of that. That was one way. Another is that the angling of the yards meant that he could diversify the patches in between greater than was done in Accordia. And so it opened up a series of potentials simply about spatial diversification in general. But then on top of that could begin to ask larger questions about a broadening of uses and possibilities of collaboration. So in that sense, we can now start to think about, well, is it makerspace or is it care environments or, therapy, the therapy clusters? And, we can start to look at a whole series of possibilities that might be attractive. And then, as I think he's arguing correctly, just like with Accordia, it's the urban villas that offer the opportunity for densification. And so then you start to realize that this scheme is no longer simply the private domain that it is in Accordia, but becomes a wider urban resource for integrating the sort of use functions across a wider area. And that's what I think is the series of interesting diversifications, broadening, and reversal of the Accordia model.
No, Aditya, I can only say I'm completely floored. I'm super impressed by this. And I was just asking me, do I regret sending you here or recommending you here? Absolutely not. Because when Aditya asked me, he wanted to do a graduate course in AA, what should he choose? I said, without doubt, you come to housing and urbanism, precisely because of this kind of work that is produced, the kind of conversations and investigation and the depth of discussion, right, and debate that we could have at the end of the course. And I can only say that I completely congratulate you on this. The output has been incredibly amazing, right? Both in terms of the refinement, the thought that has gone behind it. So then, so it leaves me with very little to say in a way. But maybe I add to say that with such a brilliant scheme like this, sometimes one would ask, when I leave the building today, walking home, I would ask myself, what have I learned from Aditya? Right? And I think usually the best schemes forces one to think differently about things that we take for granted. And if I have to answer that question, what have I learned from Aditya today? I would say two things. I think what I found most illuminating and I found most enjoyable and also made me think hard is the way in which, let's say, introducing the question of how do we nest workspace, right, in such a way that it is not only now, as Ingrid has said, confined to the dining table where it is hidden away and in which you truly work from home, in home, and never leave home, where workspace or work from home space is calibrated so well, so finely, and is able to translate from different conditions, from the largest of space to the finest of space, to the one that is hidden that can only be glimpsed when the pinwheel begin to reveal itself in the gaps, and one in which you can only encounter when you traverse through the central core. And I think it's that level of nuance, that level of calibration of where you place those workspace and how that transform a typology that is so, like Accordia, that is so well known and so well received and understood. I think to me that was a really great example. And so much so that as you said, to create a community, I think a sense of community can also arise from a housing development when there is a certain tectonic cohesion and organizational cohesion that is also legible. And this is where I think it's incredibly successful, because one could traverse, let's say from, I do not know where north and south, but let's say from the right side of the collage to the left side, one could really see that transition, right? Where workspaces are seen as large work halls to one that are yard-like, but also one that is also collapsed with domestic space behind it, right? It's almost as it were a mise-en-scene that could be seen in both directions, in the linear direction, but also the perpendicular direction. And then, of course, traversing that towards the park, in which so well put together, in which the block is seen as villas in a park, right? And in which, again, the workspace is only glimpsed through the cracks of those 4 pinwheels. Which also then leads me to the second aspect, which I thought that introduction of a timber tectonic, I think, is very promising here, in which I think for the past maybe 5-10 years, I think timber has been used in housing in the UK, in which it's completely hidden, right? And in which usually a Georgian facade or, a London vernacular brick facade is then pasted on. You wouldn't even know that there is a timber tectonic behind it. And I think that where I find interesting here is that there is and can be further investment in which the tectonic that is afforded by CLT, the tectonic that is afforded by glulam structure, creates another layer of richness that would agitate against the typologies that you've talked about. So therefore, when we talk about the CLT structure, which is essentially a wall structure, it's very, very apparent in the way in which the lower rise, right, the terrace house structure is being deployed. And this is where, for instance, the tectonic of the wall becomes more pronounced. And when you move towards the larger hall structure, suddenly the wall structure turns into a glulam structure, and in which the rafter creates another kind of tectonic, bringing light in, regulating the space, but still in a way allowing a hint of the linearity that you see in the low rise, right? So again, it comes back to what I've said about the legibility of a cohesion of buildings, right? That makes the community possible, that we live in a very diverse assemblage of typology, but nevertheless shares a readable, legible, irreducible structure that is both typological but also structural tectonic that comes from a material with sequestered carbon. So I think, to me, it's an incredible project, and it's incredibly rich and fully accomplished, and I can only say congratulations.
Other comments? Well, actually,
I would love to see again. For me, the part which I find the most interesting is the middle part, the terraces, and I would like to see the detailed plans again, and for you to actually explain how the plans. Yeah, you just passed it.
Go to the TV.
Yeah.
This one.
Yeah, I'd like to know more about how this works. Is it a type which is fixed, or is a type going to evolve? And how does it work? I mean, because that seems to me quite crucial, and you haven't said that much about it.
So I was thinking of CLT framework. So it's almost the columns are fixed, and so we have, I think the dimensions are here. So you have a 7-meter bar in the front, it's 5 meters and 3 and 7, and 2 patios that are 3 meters each. And so the framework is of the column and beam is fixed, but then the walls become movable. And so if this we imagine as one dwelling, we can imagine 2 dwellings combining, and which allows for different shared living to exist.
There's flexibility naturally.
There is flexibility laterally, yes.
And not in the lengths?
There is no flexibility in the length. You still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 volumes which are static, but flexibility.
Why is that?
Static in the sense there is a grid, but we can choose to put a wall here or sliding windows. So there is flexibility along this length as well. So 2 volumes can combine. And in case we wanted to close off the roof of the patio with glazing, this can become a single room as well. So there is flexibility in both directions.
Maybe picking up on that further. So here we see a plan that has got bidirectional striation with a regularity to it. And presumably you made a decision about the dimension. And is that decision based on rejecting, extending, copying? What did you do with the
So
Accordia
the Accordia
dimensions?
diagram is 4.5 meters in length, and the Jorgenteller is 8 meters. The 4.5 in width, and the Jorgenteller was 8 meters. And so this allowed for much more variation in striation. And Accordia is 4.5. If I can go back to the drawing, that corridor becomes very narrow, but making that 3 meters allows that corridor to also act as a kitchen that can extend into the patio.
Is there a way? Is there an option where you can just remove the third cell, so that you have a variated terrace depth,
The third,
and then you add it in later if you need to. So you do have flexibility within the grid. So you just have 2 units rather than 3. So where you've got the open workshop, say, move to the right. To the right, bit further over, next the double width one.
this one?
If that wasn't a building, it was just an open space, then you could put the cell in later, I suppose. You can build it that way.
Oh, it was just a point about the sort of the beauty of the economy and efficiency in the system, actually. And yeah, there are, as Chris mentions, the sort of tectonic of the CLT wall, but it also looks like there's a glulam frame counter to that, which will give you that flexibility. So there is a very strong structure there, an armature, but flexibility within that. And I was going to ask about, and you mentioned it very briefly, you didn't have a lot of time, about the multi-generational kind of factor in this and how that works. And you suggested that there might be some of the spaces liberated to the next generation down. Didn't quite understand that, but I think that's another kind of thing you could weave through this scheme, which would enrich it again and make more explicit, possibly, as it's published. Because when you read the care implies that, the care aspect of it does imply that although we all benefit from making and fixing things, from sewing and knitting and whatever we do, however we fix things, I get that. But the care aspect at that end of life could be interesting to explore.
Old people and carers. So there's going to be more old people than makers. There are going to be more old people in 20 years than there are makers, I think. So I think having an option where they become the new makers and look after them, I think could be quite interesting.
I know early on in Aditya's work, he said that Irene is completely under-enthused about Accordia. And I'm wondering now, do you see any potential that you didn't see before because of Aditya's work?
How am I going to answer that one? Actually, I'm interested in the other type, if it is a type, which is your adaptation of Jürgen Teller's house, and in the succession of rooms for certain use which have an open space in between. And I think part of my reasons to ask you to give us more details is that, I have been to Jürgen Teller's house. I think it's a very accomplished project. At the same time, I always wonder how practical it is as a strategy. And it's very nice when you're in a room looking onto a yard. But I'm intrigued by how one could extend this into thinking of it as a type. And that's why, this plan, which I think is potentially extremely engaging, raises questions in my mind which are intriguing. And I'm not sure as yet I know enough in order to say, yeah, that's a great idea. And I would actually like to see a part of it in greater details. You've shown the sections, but not the plans in greater details. And so that I could understand how the plan might evolve in time in relation to the issues that interest you, which are to do with care, with work, and so on. In fact, perhaps almost too many issues are being considered. Yeah.
It's interesting. I think, you know, something that we've been discussing in the work is sort of taking the idea of the Eames House as another model of a type where that courtyard space probably acts in a very different way to Teller, although I know obviously that it's a diagrammatic sense, it's very similar. And it's interesting if you stay on this one actually, because that idea that there is a kind of open space that allows the integration of work and living. You know, an Eames House was obviously premised on the idea that the house doesn't get in the way of doing either of those things, and a life in work. That, you know, there is continuity and there's transparency. You can see all the way through from one end to the other. Yet there are separations. And the fact that you can weave across the circulation zone, but also there's separation and striation through the short width of the plan. And interestingly, you know, that's what was interesting for this image. And I saw on the plan, the stair is actually open tread in the Eames House. So it doesn't actually stop that relationship through the length of the plan. And here you've got solidity. Yeah. Maybe that's the constraint of the CLT construction. So, you know, there are, you know, an expanded set of typologies and exemplars that could enrich this exploration even further beyond just the kind of duality of Teller versus Accordia.
Well done. I was just going to make sure I emphasize what Chris was saying as well, was the tectonic. And in the back of that typology stuff and the layering that we were just talking about, I actually think the thought you put into the materials is actually quite important here as well, because they actually help us make and experience these type of spaces better. Yeah. So I think you should be applauded for that.
I think Irene is raising a really important question, and maybe we want to emphasize just a little bit more in terms of where we are in the year. You all are concluding, all the students we've seen today, while our phase one students are looking at this and then understanding their goal. And in a sense, what Irene has just pointed out to us is that we need a quite specific investigation of the dwelling as a kind of as a complete unit. And we need to be told a little bit more about the qualities of the dwelling, not so much simply as a system, because a lot of what you were showing us was how the system works, but then the resolution of the detail of the dwelling itself is what will allow us perhaps to feel convinced about the variations. And so I think one of the things that we're going to be doing this coming term in domesticity, and we're going to draft in some help on that, is to start to model and envision the idea of the dwelling itself as something that has got to work within a larger system, so that the type can be explored kind of with the same along the same time frame as the discussion of the system. So one of the things that I think that we've noticed in many years of housing and urbanism is that we tend to prioritize the urban system and then get around a little bit too late to the characteristics of the dwelling itself. Now, earlier today, we could see that in Anaga's work, for example, the dwelling was quite highly resolved, and almost to the point where the city had to take a second fiddle position. And what we, I think, want to do is to find a way to combine these two modes of investigation in a kind of complementary time frame. So it's really important, I think, to hear Irene's comments on that. And, you will recall, Aditya, there were a few points relatively late into the autumn where we were asking you, show us one complete dwelling. And, in a way, when we're spending so much time showing that the system works, we can sometimes forget that challenge. Yeah. Are there any other comments or questions on Aditya's work? Then let me ask Graham, Chris, and Lee if you have any thoughts about the work overall. If you do, we'd be delighted to hear it. Otherwise, we can bring it to a close. But I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, I'll just say that the subjects you're addressing are really, really relevant and topical. I mean, they're really seriously relevant, actually. I saw on the radio, or was it TV, that somebody was asking Jeremy Corbyn what his opening speech would be on the steps of Downing Street had he got in. And apparently it would be to end homelessness. And I think it was kind of radical in a way, but it was kind of interesting that that's still a major factor in a developed country, and it's getting worse. We're not quite like San Francisco and Manhattan just yet, but we're getting there. So I think that's interesting from your program's point of view. But then you talk a lot about dwellings, and I think another really topical thing that is tricky right now is, what is a dwelling? What is can we all be Jürgen Tallers and have multi-million-pound houses? Do we need them? What's happening in Manchester, where we've got small shared ownership units, where the average age of the inhabitants is 30 years old, and they literally have a one-bed flat, basically. What is dwelling, I think, in cities? And I think the typological study is really interesting, I think. And then if you could put it into sort of, I think you did it well with Croydon, because you're saying this bit of Croydon needs this sort of dwelling. This bit of Manhattan might need a totally different model for dwelling. And I think this idea of dwelling being universally understood is questionable, actually. I think we're having to review it more intensely. So, but I think the program's objectives are really, they're just really spot on, actually, at the moment, in terms of a lot of urban issues that people in practice are trying to face. And I think it's good to see this, because I don't know whether Joanna said it earlier in the morning, but the constraints that are thrown at us are incredible. And you have clients that don't see dwellings; they see one particular layout, one particular flat. That the numbers, the areas that you have to get them down to are really tight in terms of viability. So it's really refreshing to look at, a more less encumbered way of looking at dwellings again, and I think it's urgently needed, I think, in the profession, because we're all being pushed more and more down a route that is very questionable. So we've all rallied around sustainability, and I think we need to rally about living, and how do we create cities that are meaningful and are sustainable, not just in their CO2 credentials, but in terms of community and care and various other things. So I think you're onto some interesting stuff.
No, I have enjoyed the afternoon. I wish to see more, actually, but there's only 3, but I've enjoyed this very much. And I think credit to the students and to Larry and everyone teaching that. I have to say, every year it gets better. So I think that's a real testament that the program is always gaining strength to strength. Only thing that, and I agree with Graham as well, all the topics and themes that has been raised are incredibly relevant. They are the issues that we are grappling with in practice, but of course with more, constraint and inflation, not just only in interest rate inflation, but also policy inflation. You know, you have to meet these targets and meet that target. It's becoming very difficult, and also difficult to invent, right? What I also think it's really impressed is how much you guys work in such a short time. Because it's October, November, December, just about 3 months to come up with a thesis. It's really a very short time with a tremendous amount of work. And I'm just wondering if, I do not know whether you've already done it in the program, perhaps to streamline the work even more so that larger questions could be raised more collectively and therefore a more, I would say, unified response. Perhaps every year you guys are given a theme, for instance, right? If it's, let's say, it's about craftsmanship or workspace, then everyone looks at that. I do not know whether that's happening, because then I think every year you will be able almost to create a report, almost a white paper, to say, this is what we've learned very, very clearly. Because what I felt that the students are incredible. You know, they really, you can see that they can bring a lot to the table. Yeah. But congratulations, yeah, to the students and the staff.
Yeah, it's great actually to finish on this piece of work actually, which is a new build, but a very credible one. and that adaptive, and I've only seen the 3 projects as well. And that adaptive reuse, of course, is hypercritical. We all know that, but to end on a kind of inspirational project like this, which I thought the other students will see, is really wonderful actually. It's so rich and an exemplar, I think actually. You know, I think that, because in MRH there's always been a tension between the kind of written piece and the proposal, you know, and this suggests that there's a silent kind of that's imbalanced, and that this is evidence of that. I think it's really important to have strong evidence in well thought out, well resolved, and incredibly well drawn proposals as you have. So I think you're in a healthy spot as we can see.
Again, I'm going to make a small detour. When we spoke, or when you spoke about the relationship between the cultivation of self and work and living, working, I think the aspirations of your scheme are not dissimilar to what Sharon tried to do in the 60s and 70s, but in the context of social housing. Yeah, so I think, I'm not saying it's been super successfully realized, but what he managed to do is to have a very varied dwelling range where every dwelling, even if it was a single dwelling, had a workspace, and every dwelling had a collective space, and every room had a particular space for a desk. And these desks, they were arrayed and oriented facing outwards, so that each dwelling, in a total minimal condition, both had the possibility of collective living, but also for the cultivation of self. And Sharon was very clear that was his driving force to sort of bring these two things together. That dwelling was not just about domesticity; it really was about the cultivation of self through work, through discussion with friends, sort of thing. Coming to your scheme, I think to me it'd be really interesting. And it relates back to Larry's question, to really think about the dwelling ranges. If maybe students could really show the range of inhabitations a bit more clearly, or we could spend a bit more time thinking about how could this work in terms of intergenerational living, how could this work for much smaller dwellings? Because I think Akodia, very nice, and a lot of your schemes, very nice. I totally agree with everything you presented. But I can also see how easily this could become a upper middle class enclave. Yeah. So, and I think, of course, that also doesn't make for such a great city the way we like to think about the city. So I think to think about the range of the offer and also produce qualities at a range of scales through the architecture, through the way the view engenders a generosity of space, I think it'd be really interesting to sort of maybe, widen the references generally in terms of, looking back at the way in which dwelling has been experimenting with compression of space and opening up of space visually. And I think, modernism was actually quite good at that, not all modernism. So I think that would be an interesting experiment to sort of, juxtapose something as generous as Arcadia with something as hardcore as Sharon Charlottenburg North or Ungers in Merkurisviertel, or, there's a whole range of other examples one could look at where you can really learn also from the floor plan about the particularity of the way the walls are organized and what you see and what you can view and where you're situated, sort of thing. But of course, it's a challenge, as we said. I think I like it about the program so much is the reasoning across scales, that you all have the capacity to think about the room, the dwelling, the neighborhood, the city. So I wouldn't want to lose that. So I'm not sure if it's really possible to go into that much depth on both of these scales. But I think given that the program becomes richer in terms of resolving things across scales, I don't know, maybe you can square the circle at some point.
I think we've had a very illuminating day, and I would like to thank our 6 presenting students from Frank this morning, Aniga, Antarup, Ray, Zainab, and Aditya. It's been a fantastic day seeing the achievements that you've brought to us, all of you. So thank you very much.